I'm Davy, and I'm awesome! And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things, all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. This week, I'm going to be reviewing a documentary that brings together two of my passions, comedy and wrestling. The comedy side being one of my favorite comedians, somebody I was a big fan of, Andy Kaufman, and his world into wrestling. This week, I'm reviewing the documentary, Andy Kaufman, I'm from Hollywood. This documentary was directed by Andy Kaufman's longtime girlfriend, up until the day he died, Lynn Margulies, and Joe Orr. And it's a short documentary. It only runs about 61 minutes. So if you're one of those people who are like, I don't got time for documentaries, you got time for this one. And it chronicles Andy Kaufman's life in wrestling. About how, as a kid, he was a big wrestling fan, wanted to be a wrestler so bad, but he was just too small to be a wrestler. Back then, at least. Nowadays, he'd pretty much be average size for these wrestlers. Then again, still really didn't have, the build for a wrestler. But that didn't deter him. It just made him realize he had to come up with a gimmick. His gimmick? He wrestled women. Even to the point of naming himself the very first intergender champion of the world. Now that belt looks a little different. But then again, this was at a time when that was extremely taboo. Now we got wrestling leagues where it's not uncommon for women to wrestle men. Kind of like in Lucha Underground. It was just the way it is. In Impact Wrestling right now, certain women are wrestling men all the time, especially over the Digital Media Championship, which is defended against men or women. Heck, they even had the distinction of being the first league to let a woman be their world champion. But back in this time, you gotta remember, this was late 70s, early 80s. Very taboo. And of course, this had to mean that Andy Kaufman be the bad guy, which he played to perfection. Just the Weasley bad guy, pretending he was a chauvinist, which is funny because in real life, he was very, very pro women's rights. And this documentary chronicles him going to Memphis, one of the biggest territories at the time. Gotta remember, this is pre-WWF heyday. This is pre-WCW even. This is still when WCW was NWA Mid-Atlantic. But going down to Memphis and getting the attention of their biggest attraction, Jerry the King Lawler. Which if I was ever going to compile a list of the top 10 wrestling rivalries ever, I honestly think that Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman would have to be on that list. Because here's the thing, I wasn't even old enough to witness this rivalry while it was going on. And even if I was old enough, I wouldn't have seen it. I didn't live near Memphis. This was the territory days. This is the days where you watched what was local, even the WWF. At this point in time, this was when it was still pretty much only available around New York. But just seeing all the documentaries all the times, and not gonna lie, the nerdy fan I am, I've gone back and watched old videos of this. Man, you could feel Andy Kaufman getting underneath Jerry Lawler's skin. Which led, of course, to the famous match between Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman, where Jerry Lawler pile drove him twice. Which, to this day, is still one of the most dangerous moves in wrestling ever. And this was being done to a non-wrestler, who thought he had a chance at Jerry Lawler because, well, he's beaten women bigger than Jerry Lawler. And of course, going into Andy Kaufman and his kayfabe neck injury, that resulted in him trying to apologize on Letterman, getting into another altercation with Lawler, where Lawler slapped him out of his chair. Which lately has been the big joke on the internets that Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman did it way before Will and Chris, and way better. And Andy Kaufman, in his effort to get revenge, teaming up with Jimmy Hart and his wrestler, the Assassin, to go after Jerry Lawler, which ended up getting Andy Kaufman a little bit of revenge, where he knocked out Jerry Lawler with boxing gloves and started singing how he's the king of Memphis, Tennessee. And of course, the I'm from Hollywood title going from what he kept saying throughout most of his promos that he was from Hollywood. He really, really pissed off Memphis when he was down there, constantly calling him dirty, telling them about brand new inventions they should try out, like soap and toilet paper. Turns out the South doesn't like it when we call them dummies. The only thing about this documentary, though, is it basically made out that the culmination of the rivalry was Andy Kaufman teaming up with Jerry Lawler and then turning on him because it was all a ruse to get back at him. That actually didn't happen at the culmination of this rivalry. It happened somewhere in the middle. But the main focus of this documentary was how they basically felt that this is what ruined Andy Kaufman's career. Because again, not only was this the territory days, this was the kayfabe days. This was the days when a lot of people didn't really accept that wrestling was not real. That these were guys playing parts, characters. They were not really like this. So when Andy Kaufman was going on television, presenting himself this way, a lot of people didn't take it as being a character. They took it as in, this is Andy Kaufman. And of course, he's old school wrestler, so he kept that persona going. So in some ways, it's accurate. It kind of killed his career in Hollywood. However, I personally think that if he hadn't have stopped, he could have had a very successful career as a wrestling manager. At that point in time, there was no chance of him being a legit wrestler. It just wasn't. But man, if he would have been a wrestling manager, especially when the territory days ended, which sadly was around the time that he died, but still, if he would have lived longer, been a wrestling manager, he'd have been remembered with guys like Jimmy Hart and Bobby the Brain Heenan. No doubt in my mind on that one. This documentary also had some commentaries from, of course, Jerry Lawler and the commentator from Memphis at the time, Lance Russell, and of course people that knew Andy Kaufman around that time, like his co-stars from Taxi, Mary Lou Henner, and Tony Danza. His co-writer, partner in crime, and referee in most of his matches, Bob Zmuda, was of course a part of this documentary. And even somebody he didn't co-star with in anything, didn't write with anything, just a friend of his, Robin Williams, was in this documentary. I remember watching this documentary on Comedy Central when I was a kid, but now that it's out there on DVD, that's even cooler, especially because if you get the deluxe DVD, it comes with a copy of not only I'm From Hollywood, but My Breakfast with Blassie, where he had breakfast with classy Freddie Blassie. I may review that one someday. And as both an Andy Kaufman and a wrestling fan, how could you go wrong? Highly recommend you guys search out and check out Andy Kaufman, I'm From Hollywood. It's great, it's nostalgic, it takes you back to the old school days, and it's wrestling and Andy Kaufman. Need I say more? So there you have it, that's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notifications for when I post the videos, and leave a comment. If you've seen Andy Kaufman's I'm From Hollywood, tell me what you thought about it. If you haven't seen it, tell me you're going to check it out. Love you guys.